Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I am Ashmit Kumar. Now, cash-strapped telecom company Vodafone Idea is staring at a bleak future as the government has made it clear that it is unlikely to grant any relief on the adjusted gross revenue. Now, what's important is that CNBC-TV18 was the first to report on the government's stance after a Supreme Court bench rejected Vodafone Idea's plea seeking a waiver on interest and penalty payments. Now, the apex court had even expressed shock that a plea was filed despite a relief being ruled out in previous orders. Now, the management, during an earnings call, has, however, said that they see no reason why the government should be constrained in any way to offer relief if it decides to do so. However, Telecom Minister Jyotiraditya Scindia, in an interview with Times of India, had said, and I quote, the Supreme Court's ruling on the matter, and that's where it stands, end of quote. So where does Vodafone Idea go from here? Remember, the government owns 49% stake in the telecom company. Scindia also told Times of India that it does not see the government hiking its stake in the telecom company in the near future. The stake will stay at 49%. That's the message that the DOT is giving. And joining me now to take this discussion ahead is with us senior advocate, Mr. Gopal Jain. Mr. Jain, thank you so much for joining us, being a part of this conversation. First question, the AGR issue, it's being argued at length for a decade and a half. It doesn't cease even before the apex court. This time, the Supreme Court says, I'm shocked you're coming to me when there are very clear, distinct rulings that the Supreme Court has given that there will be no relief, at least not on the legal front, at least not from the Supreme Court. With the Supreme Court clearing the air, do we now reach the end of the road as far as AGR is concerned? Is that a finality that no AGR relief is coming the telecom company's way? Mr. Jain.
I think we have to look at it in the present context. That, as you said, has been the position so far in terms of the matter of AGR and the Supreme Court judgment. But let's look at it constructively. There's one significant change which has happened, that the government itself is a 49% shareholder. And second, as we know, government has full policy powers. Way back in 99, the government came up with the migration package when it felt the telecom sector required a rescue package or a bailout. In the same manner, executive instructions and a full policy package, which I call a resolution package, given it's a 49% shareholder, and how important it is to have at least 3 healthy service providers, would be a solution from a policy perspective. So I think we should look at it pragmatically and constructively to see what is it which can happen, which will create a turnaround point. And we've moved on now from what the Supreme Court judgment said to a way forward. And I think that's the lens through which we should look at any conversation going forward.
Let me bring in the formal submission that the government has made. The formal submission, the formal reply that the government gave to Vodafone Idea when it had asked for relief. The formal reply by the government was, look, Supreme Court has given the judgment. Our hands are tied. We cannot examine. The same question was asked of them before the Supreme Court as well. Again, the response that fell from the Solicitor General was, our hands are tied, Supreme Court judgment, and therefore we cannot consider or examine any further relief. Now we also hear from the Telecom Minister when he says, there's nothing on my table, and that the Supreme Court judgment is the final word, and that will be followed in spirit, in letter and spirit. Does that mean that at least on the AGR relief, the demand for waiver, the request for interest as well as penalty waiver, that will be extremely challenging going forward for the government to do now in light of repeated Supreme Court rulings?
Starting on a lighter note, using a telecom expression, hands-free. So let's think of a hands-free approach. Number one, yes, when the Supreme Court takes a decision, there is a sense of finality to it. There's no running away from that fact. Point number two, when the 2G judgment came, there was a presidential reference. Recently, you've seen it on some other aspect. So it is something that is a dynamic process of thinking. How do you find an out-of-the-box solution? And using an expression which is now a current favorite drawn from the IBC, resolution or a path forward. So I think a proactive approach from the point of view of the government, both for the sector, for having competitiveness, as well as from the perspective that is the shareholder, would be a different way and a path for it to go forward. And I gave you one example of a migration package where you move from a fixed to a revenue sharing regime. That was also through a policy instrument. So let's think, what are the various different ways forward in which somebody could do it? And I always think a policy package, therefore, could be one way of looking at it. And from that, we can start a conversation as to how we can find a solution for this issue.
Sure. Mr. Ranina is also joining us. Mr. Ranina, thank you so much for taking our time to speak to us. Again, first question, the same question that I posed to Mr. Gopal Jain as well, that the DOT repeatedly has said before the Supreme Court to Vodafone Idea that, look, I can't move forward because of the Supreme Court judgment. Do you see any room to maneuver now with the Supreme Court having cleared the air once and for all, saying that, look, this is us clarifying for the nth time that there is no intervention that can be expected from the Supreme Court? Do you take away anything from that?
Well, it always means, obviously, it means that the executive has its own powers. Supreme Court will not intervene. So if the executive wants to help a Vodafone come to a policy decision, yes, they can. The Supreme Court has very clearly said we won't intervene if the government wants to help you out. But we can't direct the government to help you out because it is part of their domain. If what is in their domain, only they can do it. Supreme Court cannot act on that. So the Supreme Court is absolutely right when it says it will not intervene, it will not interfere, but you are free to go to the government, let the government help you if they so wish. It's a big if. They've used the word if in their judgment, as you see, Ashmit.
Let me follow that up with another question. You're making a reference to an observation that fell from the bench. The bench said that, look, if the government wants to help, we won't come in your way. That was an observation. But what's interesting is that despite repeated requests from the councils of the telecom companies, that observation does not find mention in the order. So is there any takeaway there for the government if it wants to even contemplate any relief? Can it do so? Can it do so after having told the Supreme Court, I can't do this, I can't consider their request, I can't even consider their request after the Supreme Court judgment in the AGR case? Mr. Ranina.
Possibly what they mean by that, the council meant was that maybe the government does not have the financial capability of intervening because this will cost a lot of money. It's taxpayers' money. If you want to give some benefit, or if they want to reduce the penalty or whatever they want to do. So that's what I think the counsel for the government mentioned, where he says, I don't want to do it. It's not that they can't do it. Government can do it. And if the government wants to help them out, they can. But as you see, the minister, Mr. Jyotiraditya Scindia, has very clearly said that they don't want to. And they are left to themselves now. The telecom companies either have to raise funds from their own promoters, shareholders, or go to the market and raise funds.
Sure. Mr. Jain, let me come to you in terms of policy levers. Even assuming that the AGR is not somewhere that the government would like to tread as of right now with repeated Supreme Court rulings, are there other policy levers with which the government can maneuver if it wants to do so, to grant relief to the telecom space? And would it be advisable to do it, to make it company-specific as opposed to having a more sector-wide approach?
That's why I said it has to be a sector-wise constructive package. For example, the impetus that the government has given to manufacturing or some of the new age sectors, EV being a good example. So one has to think in that context and perspective. And most importantly, to have a healthy, competitive telecom sector is also a matter of public and national interest. We've seen, for example, in the airline sector, having one airline less has had a huge effect. So I think a larger sectoral policy perspective is what one should look at. And that could also bring benefit, as you said, to us, brackets open, a slightly more ailing company, if one may want to call it like that. And look at the IBC. What did the IBC do? It also thought, let's keep companies as a going concern, let's help entrepreneurship. So all of these are new age ways of making sure that the impact on the sector and the economy can be buffered. And therefore, I think a good incentive package for the whole sector as a whole can do it. And government always has many cards in its hand. Of course, it has to have the intent. It must wish to do it proactively. But we are only suggesting that it can be done in the realm of executive and policy decision making.
Sure. You brought up the IBC issue, Mr. Jain. I just want to get a few thoughts on that. That was, in fact, one of the concerns that the company itself raised, that shy of any government relief, the company will not be able to survive beyond FY26, could very well head into insolvency. Is that an option that is perhaps available to the government as a 49% shareholder? Can they make an application under the IBC for voluntary insolvency? Is that something, an option that perhaps can be considered, maybe on the cards?
I think that would be, advanced forecasting, which at the moment we should not do. I was giving IBC as an illustrative example of how it was used as a good turnaround mechanism as well. So the word resolution that I used really draws its strength from the intent of that legislation. And I think we should first focus on this and not cross the seven seas and look at that scenario. So sequentially at the moment, I think some kind of a policy breather, a good package like they've done for manufacturing as a whole. And I think the Viksit Bharat narrative also gives a perfect platform that we should look at the key sectors which would be drivers of economic growth, innovation, technology, and it can be done as part of that vision.
Sure. Mr. Ranina, coming to you again with the same question, that in terms of the policy levers, what are some of these levers that the government could use if it chooses to grant any relief, and whether that relief needs to be company-specific or perhaps a wider sector-wide approach?
Well, I agree with Mr. Jain that this should be specific to the entire industry. Can't be for any specific company. But I think government will come up with some solution whereby both sides will come together, have a meeting point. For example, if they say that you bring in so much amount of money, and then we will give you some concession in order to ensure that the telecom sector will be able to flourish and do what it is meant to do and give better service to the public at large, I think that could be a way out. So I have a feeling that something will come out of this, where both sides, the industry will have to bring in some amount of money, government will give some concession or some relaxation, maybe give them additional time to pay the money. I have a feeling that this will come through.
Sure. Mr. Jain, we're running out of time, so I'll come to you for one final comment. Very often the question that is raised is that minus Vodafone Idea, will we be left with a duopoly? Let me change the dynamic here. Now we're talking about Satcom as well. In fact, very recently the Telecom Minister, Mr. Scindia himself, has said that we're also likely to see the fastest Satcom rollout as far as India is concerned. Does that then change the dynamic, the underlying dynamic that we have been working with, that minus Vodafone Idea, we will be a duopoly? Does that change the dynamic with a new entrant now coming in, offering communication at a very different, with a very different paradigm, with a very different dynamic?
I think that's in addition. Satcom would be in addition that we're looking at. So it's not a set of one. If one goes, the other thing comes. I think it should be constructively. Those which are there should get stronger and should continue to offer services, in fact, enhance the quality of service. And Satcom will be another space and dimension, just like 3G, 4G, 5G was an exponential thing. But the idea should be that all stakeholders should be alive and kicking. It sends out a strong signal that we have a robust sector, and government is able to intervene effectively to make sure if the situation is slightly this way or that way, to stabilize the position. So I think that should be our approach, like a booster shot.
Wonderful, Mr. Jain. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Ranina, for giving us more color on what the road ahead may look like. It's a bleak forecast that Vodafone Idea is looking at by their own submissions in the highest court of the country. But there could potentially be some levers. That's at least what some of our panelists are telling us in terms of how the government may want to look at this issue, in terms of how the government may want to look at the wider telecom space. Mr. Ranina, Mr. Jain, thank you once again for joining us with your perspective. But moving ahead, the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum has kicked off the 8th edition of its leadership summit in Washington, D.C. overnight. Now, speaking at a fireside chat at the summit, US Second Lady Usha Vance described the relationship between India